In the late 1970s, a small nation in southern Africa stood at the edge of economic disaster. Lesotho, landlocked and fragile, depended almost entirely on its neighbor for employment, trade, and survival. Its own economy was thin, brittle, barely holding together. Most families lived off small farms carved into harsh mountain slopes. Cash was scarce, stability was an illusion, and the government, desperate to modernize, began searching for a miracle. They believed they found one. A chicken. It began with optimism. A foreign development agency arrived with grand promises. They carried charts, reports, and glossy brochures that showed a simple idea: introduce high-yield super chickens to rural villages. Chickens, they said, could transform everything. They would create income, stabilize households, improve nutrition, and build a foundation for national growth. The plan seemed harmless, even brilliant. After all, chickens were cheap, adaptable, and easy to raise. Millions around the world depended on them. No one imagined a bird could destroy a currency. But the first warning signs appeared before the plan even launched. The imported chickens were expensive, far more expensive than anything local farmers had ever purchased. Each bird cost more than some families earned in a week. To make the program work, the government had to subsidize every sale. They printed new money, they borrowed, they pushed resources they didn't have into a project that wasn't tested. And as shipments of crates arrived, loud, chaotic, filled with squawking birds, officials celebrated. They believed they'd solved poverty with feathers and optimism. The problem was simple: the chickens didn't survive. The imported birds weren't adapted to Lesotho's harsh climate. They were fragile, sensitive to cold nights, and required precise feeding that rural farmers could not afford. Within weeks, thousands of birds died. Entire shipments collapsed. Villages that expected prosperity woke up to the smell of decay and loss. Families buried birds instead of selling them. The government denied the problem at first, insisting the program was a success. But the truth spread faster than any official announcement could contain. Farmers stopped trusting the government's currency because the subsidies were paid in newly printed money that appeared almost overnight. Prices rose, markets panicked. And in the countryside, where most people lived far from banks or financial centers, rumors took root. The government was printing money recklessly and the currency was becoming worthless. They weren't wrong. As more imported birds arrived, more money entered circulation. Inflation crept steadily upward, then accelerated. What began as a development project morphed into a monetary crisis. The government, fearful of admitting failure, doubled down. They shipped more birds, they printed more money, they expanded the program to regions that didn't ask for it. Officials insisted that the economic model worked, even as farmers quietly burned the crates they arrived in. By early 1980, the crisis was unavoidable. Local farmers, now distrustful of the foreign birds, returned to their traditional chickens. These native breeds were smaller, tougher, adapted to the mountains, and almost indestructible. They survived without special feed. They lived in rough conditions. They reproduced naturally. Most importantly, everyone trusted them. The native chicken became a symbol of stability, the opposite of the expensive imports. And it was here that the real economic paradox emerged. Because the government had flooded the economy with subsidies, grants, and printed money, the country now faced a distorted market. Local chickens suddenly skyrocketed in price. Villagers began buying them not for their eggs or their meat, but as a hedge against inflation. Chickens became a store of value, a substitute currency. People traded them in secret, hiding them away like gold. A healthy hen was worth more than the paper money that supposedly represented it. The currency was still there, it just didn't matter. And this shift created chaos. As chickens replaced money, markets broke down. Prices no longer reflected reality. A single hen cost more each week. Eggs became a luxury. Meanwhile, the failing imported chickens continued draining state funds. The government printed more money to cover mounting losses. Inflation surged again. The cycle accelerated. What had begun as a development project now reshaped the entire financial system of a nation that couldn't afford even a slight shock. But beneath the surface, something even more destructive was building: a crisis of faith. Villagers told stories of imported chickens that ate everything and produced nothing. They joked bitterly that the foreign birds were cursed. They whispered that the government had chosen birds over people. And as the crisis worsened, the stories grew darker. In some regions, families refused government payments entirely. They demanded chickens instead, real chickens. Bird-for-bird transactions replaced the national currency entirely. Soon, the government realized the unthinkable. They were losing control of their monetary system to chickens. Officials gathered in emergency meetings trying to understand how a development project had mutated into an economic disaster. But the numbers told the story clearly. Subsidies were unsustainable, inflation was accelerating, and the currency was losing its meaning faster than the government could print it. They faced a crisis of legitimacy unlike anything in their history. Yet even then, the worst was still ahead. Because the government, cornered, embarrassed, and pressured by international donors, prepared to make a decision that would turn a manageable disaster into a national financial collapse. A decision involving more printed money, more imported birds, more denial, and a final policy so catastrophic that economists still use it today as a cautionary tale in development programs. The crisis was no longer about agriculture or poverty. It was about trust. And trust was vanishing, one chicken at a time. But the real collapse had not even begun. The government's panic was quiet at first: closed-door meetings, whispered arguments, scattered reports marked confidential, and a growing sense of dread inside ministry corridors. But outside, in the mountains and rural villages where most citizens lived, the collapse was loud, visible, and impossible to ignore. The imported chickens continued dying in waves, creating scenes that looked less like development success and more like agricultural catastrophe. The smell of failure hung in the air, literally. Officials knew the program was hemorrhaging money. Every month required new subsidies, new loans, and more printed currency to disguise the financial hole growing beneath the nation's feet. International donors demanded results, pushing for more distribution. More expansion, more imported flocks. They were convinced the villagers were the problem, not the chickens. Reports insisted farmers were mismanaging the birds, ignoring instructions, or failing to store feed correctly. But local people knew the truth: the foreign chickens simply couldn't survive here. Yet the government, trapped between pressure from abroad and rising anger at home, chose the worst possible path. Instead of halting the program, they doubled it. More shipments, more subsidies, more printed money, more economic distortion. What began as a misguided experiment now became a runaway policy, a policy that was about to collide with reality in the most devastating way. By 1981, village markets had transformed into surreal scenes. Prices changed weekly, sometimes daily. A bag of maize cost one amount in the morning and another by evening. Farmers began hiding their strongest hens, refusing to sell them unless the buyer offered multiple imported birds in exchange, birds that were effectively worthless the moment they arrived. Native chickens were now a commodity more trusted than the nation's currency, and people treated them like savings accounts. Entire families stored their wealth in clucking, feathered form. As imported birds collapsed, the government's spending exploded. And as spending exploded, inflation accelerated into a spiral that officials could no longer control. Entire sectors of the economy rerouted themselves around the official currency. Rural workers demanded payment in chickens or food, not money. Traders accepted livestock, crops, or even tools as barter. Farmers refused to sell eggs for paper notes that would lose value before they reached home. A currency only survives if people believe in it. But belief was evaporating. Then came the final, disastrous decision, the most destructive economic move of the crisis. In a desperate attempt to restore confidence, the government announced a new subsidy. They would guarantee the value of every imported chicken. If a bird died, the government would pay its full price to the farmer. No inspection, no proof required, just compensation instantly delivered, printed straight from the national treasury. This single decision detonated the currency from within. Villagers quickly realized what officials had not considered. A fragile chicken with a guaranteed payout became a form of instant cash. Some families accepted shipments only to recover the subsidy. Others, more bold, quietly accelerated the bird's inevitable demise. It was an open secret, one the government could not acknowledge without admitting the subsidy was a catastrophic mistake. Money printing surged to unprecedented levels as thousands of compensation claims flooded the system. Meanwhile, traders exploited the guarantee at scale. They bought struggling imported birds at deep discounts, then claimed full-price refunds. The government paid out anyway because the policy required it. A single dead bird could earn more than a week of legitimate labor. The new subsidy created an ecosystem where the fastest way to make money was to ensure the birds didn't survive. The economy became a parody of itself. Within months, imported chickens became symbols of easy profit, unofficial currency, and government incompetence. People joked that the fastest-growing industry in the nation was dead chicken production. But behind the jokes lurked a darker truth. Each payout inflated the money supply further. Each guaranteed claim devalued the currency. And each printed note pulled the nation closer to collapse. Local markets shifted again. Prices soared with terrifying speed. Traders demanded more hens for basic goods. Salaries paid in official currency fell behind the cost of living. Paper money no longer moved with value, it fell apart as soon as it touched the market. Even the black market traders preferred chickens to cash. They measured everything in feathers and eggs, not notes and coins. As inflation worsened, villagers treated government-issued money like a problem, not a solution. They accepted it reluctantly, exchanged it immediately, and priced goods far above official guidelines. People began stockpiling local chickens the way ancient empires once hoarded gold, hidden, protected, treated like wealth. A chicken, not paper, now dictated survival. The crisis exposed the nation's weakness. With most employment dependent on foreign labor and its larger neighbor, Lesotho relied heavily on remittances, money sent home by workers living abroad. But even these earnings fell victim to the collapse. Exchange rates between the national currency and the neighboring nation's currency widened sharply. Families found that money sent home was melting in value faster than it could be used. They responded in the only rational way they could. They converted foreign money into chickens the moment it arrived. Chickens became a shield against inflation. Inside the government, panic reached new heights. Officials produced report after report attempting to justify the disaster. They blamed farmers, weather, disease, foreign traders, and even fate. They insisted the imported chickens were not failing, the people simply weren't ready for modern poultry methods. But no amount of denial could hide the truth. The currency was unraveling because the government had tied its value to a bird that couldn't survive. The more they spent to fix the problem, the worse the problem became. Economists from abroad visited the country to analyze the situation. Their conclusions were devastating. They argued the program distorted the economy so severely that ordinary price signals no longer meant anything. They warned that trust once broken was nearly impossible to rebuild. But their warnings did nothing to slow the collapse. The government was caught in a vortex of its own making, forced to defend a failing system because abandoning it would expose their mistakes. Meanwhile, inflation escalated into something unmanageable. Wages evaporated. Markets broke apart. Rural communities created their own informal prices based on chickens, eggs, and barter. Entire regions functioned outside the national currency. A government can survive a policy failure. It cannot survive losing the meaning of its own money. By late 1981, the crisis reached its peak. The imported chicken program had drained the treasury, undermined the currency, destabilized rural life, and destroyed public trust. And worst of all, the government had no idea how to stop what it started. They couldn't reverse the inflation. They couldn't remove the chickens from the economy. They couldn't restore confidence. The currency was dying feather by feather. Inside the cabinet, officials prepared one final set of policies, hoping to rescue the nation. But these decisions, driven by desperation rather than strategy, would not save the economy. They would shatter it completely. Because the final stage of the collapse was coming, a stage where the government, in an attempt to regain control, would unleash an even more dangerous force into the market. A force that would turn inflation into a crisis. And a crisis into a systemic disaster. The worst was no longer ahead, it was already beginning. By early 1982, the nation stood on the edge of an abyss. Inflation was no longer a trend, it was a force of nature. Prices changed so fast that shopkeepers stopped writing numbers on boards. They chalked a price, waited an hour, erased it, and wrote another. The currency was dissolving in real time. Paper notes held no weight in the hand and no meaning in the market. The government's guarantee program had turned every imported chicken into a claim on the treasury, and the treasury was bleeding faster than it could print. The crisis created a strange fracture in society. In cities, people still tried to live as if the old system worked, collecting salaries in currency that decayed by the week. In rural areas, the change was complete. Chickens, eggs, and barter replaced money entirely. Every village became an independent microeconomy. The official currency still circulated, but only as a formality, a relic from a world that no longer existed. Confidence was gone, and confidence is the true backbone of currency. Inside the central bank, panic took the shape of mathematical graphs, rising inflation curves, collapsing reserve numbers, and projections that resembled cliffs more than lines. Economists warned that the government had only weeks to prevent a total monetary seizure. But officials were not in a position to act rationally anymore. Every decision was filtered through fear, pride, and the desperate need to appear in control. The cabinet met late into the night, sometimes debating until dawn. They faced a choice no leader wants to face. Admit the imported chicken program was a failure or continue supporting it until the nation ran out of money completely. Admitting failure meant humiliation, political fallout, and international embarrassment, so they chose denial, again. They agreed on a plan designed to restore market confidence, though in reality it revealed their complete loss of control. They announced the National Price Stabilization Act, a sweeping set of price controls intended to freeze the economy in place. Prices of basic goods were fixed. Chicken values were fixed, compensation rates were fixed, wages were fixed. But the economy was not listening. Within days, the law broke under the weight of reality. Shops closed rather than sell goods at a loss. Farmers refused to deliver eggs at government prices. Markets moved into alleys, backrooms, and behind closed doors. Everything the government tried to force became something people avoided. Currency is about belief, price controls are about force, and force cannot make people believe in money. As shortages spread across the country, desperation grew. People traveled long distances to find goods. Lines stretched into the streets. Every conversation included the same questions: who still has maize, who still has medicine, who still has fuel? And everywhere chickens. Carrying them, trading them, protecting them. A chicken was no longer food or livestock. It was purchasing power. It was wealth. It was stability. Chickens outperformed the national currency by a margin so large it became a joke among villagers. The best investment in the country had feathers. The imported birds kept arriving because canceling the shipments would expose the truth. Their survival rate dropped even further as malnutrition, disease, and stress ravaged the flocks. Compensation claims grew to absurd proportions. The government printed money to keep up, unaware they were feeding a fire that was already too large to control. By mid-year, inflation crossed levels too chaotic to calculate. Economists described it not as hyperinflation but as disintegration. When a currency loses meaning, there is no metric that can measure the damage. Markets behaved like broken machines, prices jittered, wages evaporated, and investments fled. People converted money into anything physical: tools, grain, blankets, batteries, candles, anything except the national currency. Foreign workers abroad stopped sending money home. They feared the exchange rate would devour their earnings. This cut off one of the nation's last economic lifelines. The currency plunged further, debt obligations grew unbearable, and the government realized far too late that it no longer controlled the flow of events. The turning point came with a single announcement: the government would phase out the guarantee program. Overnight, the value of imported chickens collapsed. Traders who had made fortunes off subsidies were ruined. Villagers who had relied on compensation payments found themselves stranded. And the government, having lost credibility, discovered that ending the policy did not end the crisis, it accelerated it. Markets panicked, prices jumped, people rushed to convert money into anything tangible. Chickens soared even higher in value. A single healthy local hen could buy more than a week's wages. Eggs became a microcurrency, divisible, reliable, universally accepted. Children were sent to markets with eggs instead of coins. Shopkeepers kept baskets to store them. Barter replaced transactions. Money died, barter lived. The central bank issued new notes, redesigned to look more official, more stable, more respectable. But paper cannot restore trust. The new notes circulated briefly, then vanished into drawers, hidden away as curiosities, reminders of the moment when a nation's currency failed completely. Then came the moment every collapsing economy faces: the breaking of the illusion. For months, people hoped the crisis was temporary, that the government would regain control, that stability would return, but eventually the illusion cracked, and when it cracked, it shattered. People across the country reached a collective realization. The currency was worthless, and nothing the government did could save it. This realization transformed the crisis into systemic collapse. Government salaries became meaningless, contracts became irrelevant, savings became memories, loans became unpayable, commerce fractured into thousands of local economies, and the nation, still politically intact, became economically unrecognizable. The chicken crisis was no longer a joke, it was a national trauma. Imported birds, once symbols of progress, now represented everything that had gone wrong: arrogance, mismanagement, and the catastrophic belief that policy could override reality. Historians would later describe the event in simple terms: the government had built a monetary system on an unstable foundation, a chicken that could not survive. And when the chickens died, the currency died with them. The collapse forced a reckoning. The subsidy program ended, new economic reforms were drafted, most of them painful. International lenders returned, but their assistance came with conditions. Over time, years, not months, the currency stabilized, but the scars remained. Even decades later, older villagers still laughed when telling the story to their grandchildren, the story of the years when a chicken was more valuable than money. Younger generations saw it as impossible, almost mythical. But the elders knew, they remembered the shortages, the panic, the lines, the barter, the absurdity, and above all, the truth that no one forgets. An economy doesn't collapse when money disappears. It collapses when trust disappears. And in this nation, trust vanished the moment the government printed value that only existed in theory, while feathered proof of its failure lay dead in the fields. In the end, inflation slowed, markets reopened, and salaries regained meaning. But the lesson remained etched into the country's memory. A currency is not destroyed by war, weather, or fate. It is destroyed when leaders believe they can outvote reality. And this nation learned that lesson because of one policy, one decision, and one creature, fragile, foreign, and utterly unfit for the land it was forced into. A chicken. A bird that became a symbol of economic disaster. A feathered reminder that even the smallest mistake, if multiplied by a government, can consume a nation's economy. The crisis passed, the currency survived, but the legacy remained, a warning whispered across rural markets and city streets. Never build a financial system on something that cannot stand on its own.